Most people buy butter on instinct. A glance at the colour, a guess at the price, a quick reach for whatever looks familiar. It feels simple enough until you pay closer attention and notice how far some of those blocks have drifted from the straightforward food they claim to be. What looks like butter may behave more like a soft spread, melt too fast, taste oddly thin, or leave a trace of something that shouldn't be there at all. Supermarket shelves haven't changed much on the surface yet. What sits inside the foil has shifted in ways most shoppers never see. Shortcuts in churn time, blends disguised as tradition, bright colours engineered to look wholesome, it all adds up to a quiet confusion. And while a few brands still keep their standards rooted in landcraft and traceable milk, others lean heavily on familiarity to cover what's missing. So today, we're sorting them out, 7 to avoid 2 that still earn their place, and the small details that separate the honest from the almost. Number 1. Anchor unsalted butter. You ever taste something that feels familiar but never quite lands? The moment Anchor meets the knife, the texture gives a small promise, smooth, even a touch of gloss that hints at the flavour you expect. It spreads softly across warm bread, settling into a thin, gentle layer. A faint sweetness appears, almost polite, followed by a cream note that rises halfway and then simply stalls as if the flavour ran out of breath before it reached its peak. The bite that follows is mild, steady, but restrained to the point of uncertainty, a taste that seems to know where it once belonged but hesitates to show it. That hesitation becomes clearer when set beside what Anchor used to mean on the table. Years ago, the salted version carried a warmth that lifted toast into something more comforting. You could taste a rounder cream, a slower melt, a small richness that lingered at the edge of the flavour. The unsalted block echoed that memory too, offering a gentle depth that made simple bread feel slightly more thoughtful. Yet beneath those past impressions, the present version feels thinner, lighter, and strangely distant, as though it remembers what it was supposed to deliver, but only follows the outline now. The shift is not just about nostalgia. In a blind tasting run by the Guardian's food team, the unsalted block earned 2 stars out of 5, described as soft, mild, and gentle to the point of fading. And in a separate supermarket comparison by The Sun, the salted version was noted as delicious but poor value, mainly because the 200-gram pack costs more than many 250-gram options that performed better. Taken together, those panels paint a picture that matches what many home cooks quietly feel a brand, with a familiar name that does not always justify its place on the shelf. Online comments only sharpen that picture. A shopper on a food forum wrote, "Used to be richer. Now it tastes like someone turned the volume down." Another person remarked, "Still decent, just not worth the price anymore." A home baker added, "Perfect texture for dough, but the flavour vanished in the oven." None of these comments are dramatic. They are simply small notes from people who expected a certain fullness and found a softer, flatter version instead. The tone is not angry, just quietly puzzled, as if everyone noticed the same gentle drift, but assumed it might be their own palate playing tricks. On the surface, Anchor still feels dependable. The packaging carries that familiar warmth. The brand name still signals trust. The colour reads as classic. The spreadability is excellent. But once you focus on what the butter actually brings to the food, a different truth steps forward. The flavour lacks body. The aroma stops early. The cream note flickers and falls away. And that gap between expectation and delivery grows wider once the price comes into play, especially when lower-cost supermarket blocks deliver a clearer, fuller taste. The issue isn't that Anchor has fallen apart. It hasn't. The butter simply sits in a middle ground where neither richness nor value fully meet. It works fine in quiet cooking moments and spreads beautifully at breakfast, yet the flavour arrives with a softness that feels more like an echo of its former self. And echoes, no matter how pleasant, never replace the original sound. What lingers after each bite is not disappointment, but a small question that never receives an answer. How long can a well-known name lean on memory when the taste no longer carries it? Number 2. Tesco unsalted butter. A pale block meets the knife. The surface offers little resistance. For a moment you expect a gentle aroma to rise, yet nothing really appears, as if the flavour itself chose to stay quiet. That first cut often tells the truth long before the toast reaches the plate. Tesco's unsalted butter has built its reputation on value, but value means very little when the main characteristic, the taste, sits on the softer end of the scale. In a blind panel published earlier this year by The Guardian's food team, it received 2 stars out of 5, ranked firmly at the bottom of a group that included both supermarket and premium names. Even so, that verdict was not harsh. The panel simply labelled it neutral, a polite way of saying it neither disappoints nor lifts the moment. You feel that neutrality most clearly when the butter meets warm bread. A small sheen forms. A faint hint of cream follows. By contrast, the flavour levels off almost immediately, leaving a blank space where richness should naturally bloom. Spread thinly, it fades. Spread generously, it still refuses to deepen. All told, the experience reminds you more of a functional fat than a kitchen centerpiece. Butter should offer body warmth, a small rise in appetite, yet this one rarely steps forward with any confidence. The core issue sits deeper than taste alone. Unsalted butter relies entirely on its own dairy character because there is no salt to lift the natural sweetness or sharpen the aroma. When that base flavour is muted, the absence becomes obvious. Tesco's version leans so heavily on subtlety that it crosses into emptiness, especially when compared with other options in the same price range. The texture softens quickly at room temperature, which might suggest creaminess. Yet the flavour beneath that softness feels faint, almost diffused. For simple cooking it works. For baking it behaves predictably. For anything that depends on flavour sources, pastries, or even a slice of toast on a slow morning, the gap becomes harder to ignore. That gap shows up in small human ways. A home baker folding dough notices the aroma never intensifies. A cook preparing vegetables in a little butter realizes the pan smells of heat but not of milk. Someone making a quick piece of toast finds themselves reaching for more butter, hoping the taste will finally round out. Each person shrugs it off, thinking it may have been a lighter batch, a distracted palate, a hurried morning. Yet those moments repeat, hinting at a pattern, a butter that fulfills the functional role but rarely brings any joy with it. Tesco's unsalted offering is not a failure. It is simply quiet in all the places where butter usually feels present. Mildness can be pleasant, but this sits beyond mild, closer to absent, when a product meant to carry warmth, aroma and depth leaves the palate wondering what it missed. The experience becomes more mechanical than satisfying. Still, neutrality is not the greatest fault a butter can have. Some products fall short in more telling ways through over-processed blends, confident marketing, or flavours that promise far more than they deliver. And once you've tasted something that simply lacks character, the next question becomes simple. What happens when a brand with a far louder reputation falls into the same trap? That brings us to the next story, where the name carries history, the packaging signals trust, and the flavour stops just short of earning either. Number 3. Tesco 30% less fat buttery spread. Tesco 30% less fat buttery spread returns us to the same supermarket aisle. Yet the story here moves in a completely different direction. A lighter spread suggests a gentle swap, a small step toward eating more sensibly without losing the comfort of butter. The packaging leans into that idea: soft colours, soft wording, soft promises. But the moment you move past the lid and read the construction behind it, the picture becomes far more engineered than the calm label implies. This product is not a pared-down version of butter, it is something rebuilt. Look closer, and the first difference is not what stays, but what disappears. The milk fat content drops sharply, replaced not by lighter cream, but by a blend built on rapeseed oil, palm oil water, and stabilizing agents. The logic behind those swaps sits squarely in production. Needs vegetable oils are cheaper, easier to source in large quantities, and far more stable during transport. Water keeps the texture light and the calorie number low, while emulsifiers hold the mixture together so it remains smooth even after weeks in a fridge. 2 sentences later, the picture is clear. This is not butter made lighter. It is a mixture designed to feel like butter's distant relative. And when you examine the ingredient list, you start to understand how thoroughly the original structure has been traded away. Under that claim of less fat, each added component serves a purpose that suits the manufacturer more cleanly than the eater. Emulsifiers keep the spread from separating and reduce production waste. Stabilizers reduce the number of batches that fail during chilling. Preservatives extend the shelf life, allowing pallets to move through distribution at a slower, more controlled pace. Palm oil adds firmness where the reduced dairy content weakens structure. The outcome is a product that is cheap to scale, durable throughout transport, and predictable in color and texture. It looks neat. It spreads neatly. It behaves neatly. But neatness is not flavor, and neatness is not authenticity. When viewed plainly, the marketing leans heavily on the gap between how the spread is built and how it is framed. The tub sits among real butters on the shelf rather than beside margarine, which gives the impression of belonging to the same category. The packaging tones lean toward the cues associated with dairy, cream, wheat, soft yellows to keep the association alive without saying anything misleading outright. Small phrases like buttery taste and light alternative carry warm connotations without specifying the real proportion of butter inside. And because the tub is shaped and coloured like a traditional spreadable butter, most shoppers register it subconsciously as part of the butter family line before ever checking the details. The persuasion is gentle but effective. A product built primarily on vegetable oils ends up riding on the familiarity of butter's identity simply by sharing its visual language. You feel as though you are buying something related, something only slightly adjusted, something that saves a few calories without changing the spirit of the food you enjoy. But what you actually take home is a reconstructed fat blend whose behavior in cooking and flavor on toast reflect its design more clearly than the front label ever will. So the advice here needs no drama. If you want genuine butter flavor, this is not where you will find it. If you want a stable, low-effort spread that behaves predictably in cold kitchens and on rushed mornings, it may serve that role well. The question is simply whether a mixture that looks like butter, reads like butter, and sits beside butter earns the right to be treated like one, or whether it deserves a more careful glance before it slips into the basket. Number 4. Lurpak Spreadable. Lurpak Spreadable enters the kitchen as something familiar, yet once you look beyond the silver tub, you realize it behaves less like a true butter and more like a soft add-on designed to sit quietly beside the real work. By the label's own terms, the product is a blend part butter, part rapeseed, oil, part water steamed with emulsifiers so it stays soft straight from the fridge. That mixture is not an accident. It is the result of years of pressure to make spreading easier, reduce waste, keep consistency, stable during transport, and meet the demand for a product that feels convenient at any moment of the day. After a pause, you can almost see why the blend took root. People wanted something effortless. The company delivered exactly that. Yet the very thing that makes Lurpak Spreadable effortless is what changes the way food reacts when it meets heat. Drop a small spoonful into a pan for a quick fry, and you notice how fast it thins out. The melt is instant, the sizzle is subdued. The fat spreads, but it doesn't cling or caramelize the way a full fat butter does. The oil stretches the flavor, softening the browning and muting the aroma that usually rises when butter touches a hot surface. For a simple fry, it works. For a sear, it falters. Spread it on bread, and the story repeats itself. The texture glides across the surface easily. The color stays even. Yet beneath that ease, the flavor sits faint, almost diluted, like a memory softened by time. Toast can't quite draw anything richer from it. The warmth doesn't coax out depth. You get smoothness and smoothness alone. In practice, that smoothness becomes the defining trait, gentle, consistent, and somewhat empty. Cooking with it pushes the point further. When you stir vegetables in a pan coated with Lurpak Spreadable, the sheen appears without the aroma that usually signals something good is starting. The vegetables glaze lightly, but they lack the small lift that a fuller butter gives. Sauces made with this blend take on a slippery gloss instead of a slow, creamy body. Potatoes roasted with it brown unevenly, the oil pulling away from the dairy before the heat can knit them together. Even scrambled eggs lose a shade of roundness. The butter note sits at the top instead of running through the whole dish. All of this comes back to the blend itself. Rapeseed oil carries a clean, neutral profile, useful for spreading and stability, but thin in flavour. The water holds the lightness in place. The emulsifiers keep everything uniform. Each part serves a purpose, but together they create something that never fully behaves, like butter in the pan or on the plate. The product slots into the background of dishes instead of guiding them. It becomes a supporting role that barely supports. The sensory fallout is simple. The taste drifts. The aroma softens. The melt feels fast but insubstantial, as though the character of the butter slips away before you can hold on to it. You get convenience, but not the quiet satisfaction that comes from a butter that leads the dish instead of following behind it. One evening, a man spread a thick layer on a piece of toast, straight from the toaster. He took a bite, paused, then shook his head in a slow, almost tired motion. The taste was fine, perfectly pleasant, but it missed something he remembered from years ago. Something fuller, something steadier, something that didn't feel stretched thin. He set the toast down, not annoyed, just faintly saddened by the small truth in front of him. The kitchen carried on around him, but the moment stayed still. Number 5. Country Life Spreadable. It's amusing how easily Country Life Spreadable invites you into its countryside fantasy. On the surface, the pack leans confidently on British fields, rustic typography, and a tone that hints at simple dairy craft. The suggestion is clear: this is butter with history, butter with roots, butter shaped by land and hands rather than by industry. Yet the moment you look past the imagery, the first issue emerges. The spread sitting inside that honest-looking tub isn't the traditional dairy it pretends to be, but a blend shaped by modern convenience, a product built as much for stability and speed as for flavour. That tension sits quietly beneath the lid, waiting for you to notice. Country Life Spreadable is, by the brand's own formulation, a mixture of butter and rapeseed oil. If you strip that away and consider the structure plainly, the logic becomes obvious. The butter provides identity. The oil provides spreadability straight from the fridge. Emulsifiers hold the two in line, and water adjusts texture and cost. The decision isn't mysterious. It simply reflects the pressures of current production, fewer temperature issues during transport, fewer complaints about hard butter, and a longer window for neat, predictable performance in home kitchens. The countryside scenes sell the dream. The blend inside delivers the practicality. Once that blend hits food, the sensory difference grows sharper. A small spoonful melts faster than butter, thinning into a light glaze rather than holding the deeper, slower melt of full-fat dairy. The aroma lifts for a moment, then settles into a softer, muted note. Spread on warm bread, it moves easily, but the flavour lands gently rather than rising in waves. In a hot pan, the oil asserts itself early. The sizzle softens. The browning holds back. You get lubrication rather than lift, a clear sign that while butter sits in the formula, it no longer leads the experience. Even when you stir it into vegetables or swirl it across steamed fish, the body of the flavour hovers at the edges, never stepping forward the way a full dairy fat would. The impact is subtle but persistent. Meals taste fine, just not memorable. Toast carries a sheen but not warmth. Roasted vegetables gleam without depth. Mash gains softness but misses that savoury curve that makes it satisfying. You recognise something is missing even if you cannot name it immediately. The blend performs the motions of butter, the melt, the spread, the gloss, yet each gesture arrives with a softened outline, a faint reminder that convenience has nudged aside character. It's not wrong, it's simply thinner than the story told on the outside. By the end, a small realization forms: the charm you bought into wasn't in the tub, but in the mood created around it. The fields, the typography, the implication of craft, all of it builds a version of country life that feels rooted in tradition, even though the product itself follows a far more modern set of priorities. You aren't being misled. You're being steered gently toward an idea of heritage that doesn't fully exist inside the formula. And once you recognize that gap, the countryside on the pack feels less like a promise and more like a costume worn over something far more ordinary. Number 6. Clover Original. Steam rises from a warm slice of bread. A tub of clover sits nearby its green lid, suggesting the sort of comfort that belongs to slow weekends and easy meals. From that moment, the table feels familiar, softened by the idea of something simple and homely, a spread that seems to belong in scenes like this. But once Clover meets the heat of bread, the first clue appears. The melt is quick, almost eager, sliding into the crumb without offering much aroma. A gentle sheen forms, a faint sweetness follows, yet the flavour reaches only halfway, hovering rather than settling, as though the spread wants to behave like butter, but stops short of making a promise it cannot keep. That restraint echoes through the bite, smooth, agreeable, and oddly hollow. Look closely, and the reason for that hollow feeling becomes clearer. Clover is not pure butter. It is a carefully engineered blend built on rapeseed oil, palm oil, buttermilk, water, emulsifiers, and added vitamins. Nothing on the pack hides this. The ingredients are printed plainly, yet the overall presentation leans heavily on dairy nostalgia. Soft green fields, warm colour tones, familiar typography. The brand positions itself at the edge of heritage and simplicity, while standing on a foundation that has little to do with traditional butter making. The contrast grows sharper when you examine how each part of the mixture behaves in cooking. Rapeseed oil brings lightness, but it stretches flavour thin. Palm oil adds structure, yet stiffens the melt in a way butter never does. Emulsifiers hold everything in place, making the texture uniform but slightly elastic. And the buttermilk. It offers a mild tang, but not enough to lift the spread into something fuller. Together, the pieces create a product built more for predictability than depth, a spread that acts politely without ever taking the lead. The issue isn't scandalous, it's structural. Clover occupies a middle ground where nothing is truly wrong, yet nothing truly stands out. Spread on toast, it coats smoothly, but leaves little behind. Melted into vegetables, it creates gloss without flavour. Stirred into mash, it gives body but not richness. The blend imitates the gestures of butter while missing the slow warming rise of aroma that true dairy fat brings. You don't taste freshness. You don't taste depth. You taste convenience shaped into something that resembles tradition. And that resemblance is where the tension lies. The tub looks like a comforting choice, a throwback to easier meals, but the product inside is designed for consistency, not character. The long ingredient list isn't a flaw by itself, it's a signal. A reminder that the story on the outside and the substance on the inside do not always align. Clover meets the needs of spreadability, cost and stability, but those gains inevitably soften the flavour people believe they're returning to. One man put it plainly after taking a bite of warm toast topped with Clover. It's fine, but it's not what I remember. It feels like the taste has gone somewhere else. Number 7. Flora Original. Flora Original carries a long history of better-for-you advertising, and the familiarity of that claim sits so comfortably in the public mind that many people stop questioning what the tub is actually built from. Against its reputation, the fact here is surprisingly plain. Flora is not butter at all, but a formulated spread made from sunflower oil, rapeseed oil, and linseed oil held together with emulsifiers, stabilizers, and added vitamins. The issue lies not in the existence of these ingredients, but in the gap between what the product suggests and what the formulation truly represents. Flora leans heavily on the language of heart-friendliness and plant-based comfort, yet the balance of oils inside the tub follows a very modern industrial logic, one shaped by shelf stability, cost control, and heat resistance rather than culinary or physiological harmony. Beyond the health tone, that difference creates a quiet tension between expectation and substance, a tension that grows clearer the further you move into how the spread behaves inside the body rather than on the supermarket shelf. When examined physiologically, the story becomes more measured but less comforting. Sunflower oil carries a notably high omega-6 ratio, and while omega-6 fats are necessary in modest amounts, a chronic imbalance between omega-6 and omega-3 can nudge the body toward low-grade inflammatory pressure over time, especially when plant oils are heated repeatedly in cooking. Emulsifiers such as mono and diglycerides, used here for texture and stability, are widely accepted as safe, yet emerging research shows that frequent long-term consumption may affect the gut lining in subtle ways, altering the mucus barrier that protects intestinal tissue. Add the stabilizers and the preservatives, and the body is essentially left to negotiate a mixture optimized for manufacturing efficiency rather than biological compatibility. A public voice often referenced in the UK on this topic, Dr. Michael Mosley, has spoken about the modern rise of ultra-processed fats, noting in BBC interviews that the problem isn't the presence of plant oils themselves, but the way repeated exposure to certain emulsifiers and high omega-6 blends can shift the balance of what the body expects. It's not a warning, merely an observation, a reminder that the chemistry of convenience is rarely as neutral inside the body as it appears inside a tub. Set it beside real butter, and the sensory difference mirrors the clinical one. Flora melts quickly, but the melt feels thin, losing body before it can soak into the crumb. The aroma is light to the point of vanishing. Spread over vegetables, it polishes rather than enriches. Mixed into a pan, it behaves more like a neutral oil wearing a soft dairy accent. The flavour hovers near the edges of the dish, never settling fully. Never growing round or warm, a texture-led performance that reflects the engineering behind it. You taste function, not depth. Later in the day, an elderly man sits at a small table by a window streaked with afternoon light. He opens a fresh tub of Flora, scoops a modest swipe, and spreads it across toast with the steady automatic movement of someone who has done this every morning for years. He eats with quiet comfort, looking out at nothing in particular, unaware of the long, slow strain his body may be carrying from a product that feels gentle in hand but far more complex beneath the surface. After moving through these 7 tubs, a pattern begins to settle in familiar names, familiar colours, familiar promises, yet so many of them shaped more by production logic than by the quiet depth people expect from real dairy. You start to notice how each blend leans on memory while delivering something slimmer, lighter, or stretched thin. And that is exactly why the final part of this journey matters. Some butters still hold their ground, not perfect, not poetic, but honest in a way the others no longer manage. Now we move to the ones that earn their place on the table. Number 8. Yeo Valley Organic Butter. Yeo Valley has never depended on theatrics. Its reputation grew in a quieter way through awards certifications and years of customers describing it not as something thrilling, but as something reassuring, the kind of butter that simply behaves the way butter is supposed to. Across its record, the brand has collected recognition from the Great Taste Awards and remains certified by the Soil Association achievements that matter because they speak to process rather than presentation. Yeo Valley uses certified organic milk sourced entirely from pasture-led British farms, with strict controls on feed, antibiotics and land management. That organic status is not a marketing flourish. It demands fully traceable supply chains, healthier soil management and non-GMO feed, all conditions that raise costs but strengthen integrity. You feel that integrity long before tasting anything. It sits in the weight of the block, the colour, the firmness, and that slight resistance when you press a knife into its surface. Real customer voices echo the same theme. On Waitrose reviews, one shopper wrote, "Finally tastes like the butter we used to buy 20 years ago. Nothing weird in the aftertaste." Someone on Ocado added, "Switched from spreadables back to real butter. This one convinced me." A Mumsnet user described it simply, "Just clean and creamy like proper butter. Worth it." These aren't dramatic endorsements. They are small confirmations from people who wanted a butter that didn't melt into anonymity or carry the muted flavour of blends. By contrast, many customers said they were surprised by how little adjusting they needed. The butter slid straight into their routine as though it had always belonged there. The sensory behaviour supports those comments. When sliced cold, the butter holds a steady firmness instead of crumbling. Warmed by bread, it melts into soft pools that move in slow curves rather than rushing to oil. The colour leans naturally golden, not bright, but gently deep, a shade that comes from carotene-rich pasture rather than additives. In the pan, a small pat softens gradually, then browns into a quiet nutty aroma that feels balanced rather than sharp. On vegetables, it gives roundness without overshadowing. On toast, it settles in not loud, not flat, just deliberate. The flavour rises cleanly, a blend of subtle sweetness and savoury depth that doesn't fade mid-bite. The organic farming practices behind this aren't decorative touches. Pasture-led systems reduce silage dependence, letting cows graze on varied grasses that influence both butterfat composition and aroma. The Soil Association's standards restrict synthetic inputs, which reshapes how farms manage land rotation and feed. The milk arrives richer before any churning begins, and because the butter undergoes minimal industrial intervention, its final form doesn't need correction through additives or stabilizers. Everything remains close to its source, not engineered into shape. Price becomes part of the picture, and it carries a logic of its own. You're not paying for marketing language about wellness. You're paying for the cost of organic certification for farms that keep cows outside for longer periods, for feed that avoids shortcuts, and for a chain that stays short enough to be traced without ambiguity. Nothing about the block feels inflated or performative. The cost mirrors the standards that made it. Later in the evening, someone pulls a slice of bread from a cooling rack and spreads a thin layer of Yeo Valley across it, watching the butter sink slowly into the crumb. No drama, no fuss. Just the quiet sense that this is one of the few things on the table that doesn't pretend to be more or less than what it truly is. Number 9. Kerrygold Pure Irish Butter. You don't realise how rare an honest block of butter has become until you unwrap something like Kerrygold and feel almost instantly the quiet certainty of a product made without dodging or dilution. Set beside the others, its strength begins not with marketing, not with packaging, but with the land. It comes from a place where grass, rain and time do the work long before any machine does. Kerrygold's foundation is unusually straightforward for a modern supermarket butter. It holds a butterfat level of roughly 82%, noticeably higher than the standard British minimum. That number alone doesn't guarantee flavour, but it explains the density you feel when slicing into it, and the way it responds to heat slower, deeper, richer, like something built on patience rather than additives. You sense structure, not engineering. The proof arrives as soon as a knife touches the surface. The first cut slides through a block that holds its shape, yet yields with a gentle give, revealing a colour with its own quiet authority, not the pale near-white tone of highly processed blends, but a gold drawn from grass, sunlight and long grazing seasons. Spread across warm bread, the melt comes in stages: a soft fall at the edges, a pooling centre, and a slow release of aroma that rises without force. The flavour doesn't leap, it widens. It carries a rounded sweetness, a savoury shadow beneath it, and a depth that lingers, not because it's strong, but because it's clean. Put simply, this is the sort of butter that doesn't need to prove anything. It just arrives and behaves the way real butter should. On the land it comes from, the reasons for that behaviour are almost mundane. Irish dairy farming still leans heavily on grass-fed systems, long grazing periods, rotational pasture, and cows raised with more time outside than in. That isn't romantic nostalgia, it is farming practice. Grass diets raise beta-carotene levels, which tint the butter naturally and sharpen the flavour's warmth. Slow churning preserves aroma rather than flattening it. The minimal processing avoids the split then rebuild approach common in cheaper spreads, letting the fat stay intact instead of bending it to fit cost targets. Every part of the chain shows a kind of restraint, fewer shortcuts, fewer adjustments, fewer attempts to stretch the fat into something it's not. Cooking with it makes that restraint obvious. A small cube dropped into a pan doesn't vanish instantly. It softens at the edges, holds its colour, and only then begins to brown into a nutty, steady aroma. Vegetables gain an honest glaze instead of a reflective shimmer. Potatoes roasted with it taste fuller without needing extra seasoning. Even something as simple as eggs picks up a richness that feels earned rather than added. The butter steps forward not to dominate the dish, but to anchor it. Its price is higher, and it earns that difference through traceability rather than technique. You pay for pasture time, not emulsifiers. You pay for fat content, not fillers. You pay for colour that comes from the diet of the cows, not from colouring agents. And you pay for flavour created upstream on farms rather than manufactured downstream in blending facilities. It is still a commercial product, still scaled, still widely distributed, but its identity isn't stretched thin for the sake of convenience. By the time you finish a simple slice of toast with Kerrygold, you're left with a feeling that's almost unusual these days. The quiet assurance that the thing you're eating is exactly what it claims to be. You've just walked through 7 blocks of butter that slipped further from honesty than most of us realised, and 2 that held their ground through standards craft, and the sort of quiet consistency you only notice once the rest begin to blur. No product needs perfection, but it does need truth, and that truth usually sits in what a brand chooses to cut or chooses to keep. Butter used to be simple. A knife, a loaf, a pan, warming on the hob. Now the supermarket aisle is full of blends, fillers, boosted colours, softened textures, and promises built to look familiar, even when the flavour no longer is. That's why a little awareness goes a long way. Not suspicion, not fear, just the habit of pausing before you reach out. Thank you for staying with me through this. Whatever you choose next time, at least you'll be choosing with both eyes open.
This video does not promote division within the United States or encourage segregation. All content is presented for the purpose of exploration, analysis, and fostering discussion based on current events, public sentiment, and social trends. We fully respect the United States Constitution and all federal regulations. If today analysis made you think, drop a comment so we can keep the conversations going. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you will never miss our next independent deep dive.